tots, gràcies per venir aquí a les 7. Disculpeu les molèsties del canvi d'hora. Ens feia tanta por que els logués i ens quedéssim sense ella que li hem demanat que, sisplau, avancés una mica la conversa. Moltes gràcies. Thank you very much, Mary, for being here. Good evening.
Bona tarda.
Bravo. Jo crec que la Mary Beard pràcticament no necessita presentació. Jo diré un parell de coses molt curtes i després que tot expliqui ella coses, que és el que realment volem. Ella és catedràtica de clàssiques a la Universitat de Cambridge, també és professora de literatura antiga a la Royal Academy of Arts de Londres. Ella és una especialista en el món antic, jo crec, molt generosa, perquè és una divulgadora fabulosa. Els mitjans britànics hem pogut seguir també les seves sèries. És una intel·lectual britànica molt important i una feminista declarada. Això ho demostra a La veu i el poder de les dones, aquest llibre, dues conferències, editat per Arcàdia, que podreu trobar, per cert, després, quan acabem, a les 8 hem de marxar, perquè tanquen el COAC. Aquí agraïm també que ens hagi acollit, així una mica d'emergència, però ella anirà a l'estand de l'editorial, o sigui que si algú vol que li signi, comentar alguna cosa amb ella serà allà. Una vegada vaig llegir que la Mary Beard deia que el paper dels acadèmics és fer que les coses siguin menys simples. Quan estava llegint aquest llibre pensava que és exactament el que ella fa. Ella ens proposa unes reflexions, parteix de l'Odissea, ens parlarà de Penèlope, de Telèmac, acabarem parlant segur també de la Hillary Clinton, de la Theresa May, perquè ella vol anar més enllà del diagnòstic. Ella diu, val, d'acord, ara mateix què ens passa? Estem vivint una misogínia total, però tot és més complicat del que sembla. Això és el que vostè planteja, oi, Mary?
I think everything, you're absolutely right, Anna, everything is both more complicated and more simple. But one of the things that I wanted to do in this book, and in the lectures that preceded it, was in a sense to say, look, there is a very simple point here about women's power and about women's voice. I wanted to say, look, women are not heard, women are silenced. Now, I know that seems a little inconsistent when it's me, because I do find I am heard, right? But I think I can still represent the point. But I wanted to say that there's a way of thinking about this which really means you have to go back into deep history, have to go back into ancient history. This is not just a position that women find themselves in because they are, in a minority or not in positions of power for whatever reason. The point really is that there is something about keeping women silenced and unheard, and there's a deafness to women's voices, which actually goes back as early as we can trace Western literature. Now, that doesn't mean that there's nothing to be done about it, but just simply to treat this as a modern feminist issue, as if somehow, all we had to do was just be a bit more pushy and we could make it all work for us, is probably wrong. We have to examine where we come from and why we think as we do about women's voices.
And you start with Penelope and Telemac.
I start the first lecture, which is now the first chapter of the book, in Homer's Odyssey, which is basically 8th century BC, the second work of Western literature to survive. But from my point of view, it includes something very important, because in the first book of the 24 books of Homer's Odyssey, which, as I'm sure you know, tells the story of how Odysseus, eventually the Greek hero, gets home from the Trojan War to his long-suffering wife who stayed at home. At the very beginning of this book, we're in Odysseus' palace, and there is Penelope there, and there is Odysseus' son Telemachus, and there are also all the guys who want to take advantage of Odysseus' absence and marry Penelope. Penelope comes downstairs one day, and she hears a man singing a song. And he's singing a song which is about what a terrible time the Greek heroes are having getting home from Troy. This makes Penelope rather gloomy, and she is not very amused. So she says something like, "Please could you sing a happier song?" And then why I'm interested in this is because what then happens is what I've now identified firmly as the first example in Western literature, the first known example in Western history of a man telling a woman to shut up. Telemachus is, he's a boy. Telemachus is not very smart. He's a boy, he's a teenager. And Penelope is middle-aged, savvy, wise and sensible. And he says, "Mother, shut up. Speech is man's business. Up you go, back upstairs." And what Penelope does is go back upstairs. And I think why this is important for me is not only it's a kind of founding moment of men shutting women up, but it also absolutely defines the way that the voice and women's voicelessness isn't just a kind of accidental byproduct of women's powerlessness. As you might now say, women don't have a seat on the board, they aren't well represented in positions of power, and their voice doesn't get heard, as if that was a byproduct. What this incident with Telemachus does is say it is absolutely in the definition of female powerlessness and male power that women's voice is mute. Part of what the Odyssey is doing is not only telling the story of how Odysseus comes back home, it's telling the story of how Telemachus, his son, actually does, over 24 books, actually grow up. And the first action in his growing up is telling his mother to be quiet. Right? This goes together, it is not accidental. And I think from that, it's not that we are necessarily completely dominated by the ancient past, of course we're not. But there is something that's written into the history of Western literature which says women don't speak out. And the rest is history.
De fet, vostè destaca el fet que Telèmac li diu a la seva mare utilitzant la paraula mitos amb tot el que representa precisament aquesta paraula.
Yeah, it is very interesting because in the Greek, what Telemachus says is muthos is the business of men, not of women. And muthos, one of the meanings it has in ancient Greek is like myth. But it's much more specifically here about public, authoritative, political speech. That's to say, what Telemachus is saying is it's fine for women to gossip and giggle and prattle and do all the other sorts of insignificant kind of noise-making that women do. What they don't control, what they don't have any investment in, is public speech, and that's mythos.
De fet, vostè explica també que l'oratòria, el fet de parlar en públic, en cap moment es contemplava que pogués ser a la Roma antiga, per exemple, una cosa de dones. Era un tret masculí, una particularitat només masculina. Ningú es plantejava que pogués ser una cosa de dones.
Rome carries on, very much carries on the Greek tradition. But they examine it as the Romans